from the Toronto Star. I'm Saba Eitizaz, and this matters. COVID has set back the clock, especially women who were gaining ground, especially Indigenous women who were breaking new ground. The pandemic shrunk the ground beneath everyone's feet. The waves of the virus have swept away thousands of Canadian businesses. Stats Canada has estimated more than 25,000 have closed down since last year, and that's in Ontario alone. This has also been the pandemic of inequity, exposing the cracks that were already there. Racialized communities and the disenfranchised are the ones falling through. Research has shown that despite a steady growth in the past, Canadian businesses owned by Indigenous women have fallen prey to COVID, and it has actually spiked the systemic barriers they were already up against. In today's episode, how do we level the playing field for Indigenous women in business? And more importantly, why is it absolutely essential for Canada's economy to do that? To talk about this, I'm joined by Tabatha Bull. She is an Anishinaabe woman, a proud member of Nipissing First Nation, and the president and CEO of the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business. That's the organization that did the research on how COVID-19 is impacting the Indigenous economy. Hi, Tabatha. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So let's start with this. Can you give me a brief snapshot of Canada's Indigenous economy within the broader picture of the Canadian economy? And what's the position and importance of Indigenous women entrepreneurs within this?
So the Indigenous economy is growing at a credible rate. We know that there are close to 60,000 Indigenous-owned businesses across the country. And based on our research, we see that Indigenous businesses are being created at 9 times the rate of non-Indigenous businesses. Of course, this is pre-pandemic, and it will be important for us to measure the growth and how many businesses were able to stay in business during this period. But we really see an incredible trajectory, and it's a positive trend line for us. Overall, the Indigenous economy contributes $32 billion to GDP in Canada, but we do think that the potential is greater than $100 billion.
And COVID-19 has hit all of that hard, hasn't it? This pandemic has obviously set the clock back on all women entrepreneurship, but your organization did a study that revealed the impact on Indigenous businesses and women in particular, and it has been so much worse. Tell me what you found.
We definitely found through a study we did with Indigenous businesses that women entrepreneurs, Indigenous women-owned businesses were more likely to report a very negative impact from COVID than men-owned businesses. We also found that they were more likely to experience a drop in revenue, more than 50%. And we see this as, a couple of reasons. One, Indigenous women-owned businesses are less likely to have a relationship with a financial institution. So overall, Indigenous businesses, it's about 35% that have a relationship with a traditional financial institution, and then another 35% that would have a relationship with a financial institution. But when we look at women specifically, these numbers are even lower. And a number of the financial supports went through financial institutions, and you needed to have a pre-existing relationship. So access to financing, definitely during this period, and the inability to take on more debt has definitely impacted Indigenous women-owned businesses more. We also know that women-owned businesses are more concentrated in the service industries, which have been particularly vulnerable to the impacts of the pandemic, and about 62%. So both of those reasons are really key factors. And then, of course, like all women, the responsibility of childcare and elder care has hit all women-owned businesses, but we've seen this particularly with Indigenous women-owned businesses as well.
In terms of infrastructure, what has been the impact of switching to remote work and working from home on the Indigenous workforce? I know that there are many First Nation communities where there might be a lack of broadband and other infrastructure as well. So that must have been challenging to add to all of this.
Definitely. I mean, when we think about lack of housing infrastructure in community, lack of clean water in community, both those just from an infrastructure point of view, when we're asking families to work from home and school from home, and the housing is already overcrowded. And then when we look at a business perspective, the ability to be able to work from home either as an Indigenous employee or as a business owner, definitely without high-speed internet, has created an additional barrier. And we knew this was an issue prior to the pandemic, but I think all of us being home has definitely highlighted that for sure.
What's been the government's response so far? Do you think it has been adequate to understand and address this crisis?
So the initial programs that were rolled out back in the spring, there were a number of them that Indigenous businesses were not eligible to apply. So some of those were because they didn't have a financial institution relationship. The wage subsidy, there were a number of Indigenous businesses who couldn't apply or weren't eligible based on how their businesses were structured. And that was a requirement of the Indian Act. So not a business choice, but actually a requirement due to government regulations. So we did work closely with the government to have those programs changed, and they were very responsive to that, but it created a delay in the ability to access financing and support. And we all know that any delay during this period has been very difficult for businesses. So I feel that the government is responsive. We're just really wanting to see those programs take into account Indigenous businesses when they're first established, not after someone raises the issue with them.
And Tabatha, you became the president of the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business around the same time as the COVID-19 crisis hit, if I'm not wrong. How did that impact and inform the role that you took on at that time?
Yeah, so I was the chief operating officer for about a year and a half at CCAB, and then took the role of CEO on March 13th. So we announced to the team on Friday, and then we've been working from home ever since. So
right on time.
Yeah, definitely not as I expected. And even in the interview process, if I thought about the first 90 days, as you know, they often suggest you do, of taking over an organization, I don't think any of us knew the extent of the impact that COVID had. So it's definitely been a very incredibly busy year, but it's really shone to me the importance of business associations to be a voice for businesses at the government level and at corporate, and just to support our members to understand the different programs that were available and what needs were there, and to do the important research to understand those barriers as well.
And what about yourself? Have you faced challenges and certain situations yourself in your career and your life that have kind of stayed with you? And do you feel that this is something that has shaped your advocacy work?
Yeah, definitely. So I'm an engineer, and actually I went into engineering with the plan to someday work with Indigenous communities on energy projects. So to be that bridge between energy industry and community. And I did that for the last 5 years prior to coming to CCAB. And, you know, that was a struggle for sure, just in trying to push the importance of the work to policy, but also to ensure people understand, like, really in First Nation communities, what the lack of infrastructure is and how it means. And we did have some really great people that I worked with in that role that came and visited communities and really hit home for them. But I think in general population really doesn't understand how bad it is in some communities. And also how we can inform policy to ensure that Indigenous communities are part of the solution. And we made some really great advancements with renewable energy projects in Ontario, but I think I got to a point where I felt like I needed to move on and do something bigger. And I've always been a huge advocate of the work that CCAB does. And so it was an interesting and, you know, not an easy decision for sure to make the move, but I'm so proud that I did. And I'm so proud of the work that we do at CCAB, and the team that I have is absolutely incredible, the most dedicated people I've ever worked with. So I'm very proud to lead the organization now.
And Tabatha, we've seen that the pandemic has both highlighted and exacerbated the problems that we're seeing now. But what kind of systemic and social disadvantages have always been there, even before the COVID-19 pandemic, for women entrepreneurs from the Indigenous communities?
So I think definitely, in addition to access to financing, as women own businesses and Indigenous owned businesses, it's almost like you have two strikes against you when trying to access financing, or you're looked at as a riskier business in some situations. So that definitely, but then of course, you know, we have to talk about the systemic racism that happens in this country. Indigenous women and girls over 15 are 3.5 times more likely to experience violence in this country. And the reports that came from the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls report definitely highlight and really show the difference between how Indigenous women are treated in this country, and just, you know, that bias that is created in people's mind of an Indigenous woman. And there are so many incredible Indigenous women leaders out there that own businesses, that are leading institutions, and we really need to be shining a light on them and showing how resilient Indigenous women are and how successful they are as well. I really want to tell that story. And, even when we look at more of the recent data as well on Indigenous women and women in general, or racialized women on boards and at executive leadership, racialized women, Indigenous women are 30% less likely than their male counterparts to have an executive leadership role, and there's a significant gap on boards of Indigenous people in general, and Indigenous women as well. And we really need those diverse voices to be at the table. We need to think of women as the nation builders that we are.
We'll be right back. Did you come across this kind of bias yourself? You're talking about like this general sort of stereotype or view that some might have of what Indigenous women are supposed to be like. So coming up in your career, did that kind of inform your work as well? Have you experienced it?
I don't think many people would look at me and know that I was Indigenous. So whatever the traditional, how they picture an Indigenous woman would look. So unless I raised my voice and said that I was and identified, I have not experienced that from a perspective of someone looking at me. Definitely there's been times where I've been in meetings or in boardrooms where I've heard, racial context language being used around Indigenous people, even like little things like, let's have a powwow, or, things that are a complete misuse of what is a significant event for us. So definitely raising my voice to say that's not okay and you shouldn't be using that. But there gets a point at which it's quite burdensome and a bit tiresome. And also where you feel like, if I keep raising my voice, is that going to hurt my career and hurt my ability to move forward in this organization or in this community, even, if you're in a community setting. And I think definitely as a female engineer, I could say that there are definite times where I was made to feel like I did not fit in the room and that I had to work extra hard to prove that I was meant to be in that profession. Yeah. So, there's just a Catalyst just came out with a really great report on the emotional tax of Indigenous workers and how that really does wear on a person. And in speaking to Indigenous women entrepreneurs, I know quite a few of them who've actually started their own business because they didn't feel that they could be successful within the corporate world. So that's really what we need to work to change.
Can be quite exhausting. It's so much invisible labor that we don't even consider when we're talking about Indigenous women or racialized women when they are making their way into the field and the career. A lot of the unsaid and a lot of the self-conversations that we have are actually a part of the labor as well, right? So interestingly, we just talked about systemic racism and financing. And we know that because of policies like the Indian Act, the entrepreneurial and economic autonomy of Indigenous people is somewhat made challenging. And it's made financing as one of the most persistent problems when it comes to entrepreneurship. Could you shed some more light on that? What kind of obstacles would, let's say, a woman from the Indigenous community come up against when she's trying to start a small to medium business?
So I think part of it is really about the history in our country. So, Indigenous people were intentionally removed from the economy of Canada through the Indian Act. It really wasn't that long ago that the Indian Act still said that Indigenous people couldn't trade, they couldn't farm, and then take the produce that they farmed and sell it off of the First Nation without permission from an Indian agent. There was also a prohibition on them being able to purchase farm equipment without permission from an Indian agent. And also, as Indigenous people, if you got a post-secondary degree, or be it a lawyer or a doctor or an engineer, you lost your status as an Indigenous person until very late 50s. And then as Indigenous women, there's sexual discrimination in the Indian Act. So if you were an Indigenous woman and married a non-Indigenous man, you also lost your status. So we have all these people who are just reclaiming or being seen as Indigenous under the government of Canada's lens and being able to then enter back into the economy. So the relationship between Indigenous people and banks and financiers and business is very young because of that. So it's taken some time for sure for us to reclaim that part of the economy. And I think that has the biggest impact from an overall systemic reason. And then, of course, it's difficult for many women entrepreneurs to get financing, but Indigenous women, and it's even more so for some of those reasons, just not having that relationship. And then, as we said, from just unconscious or conscious bias that exists.
And despite these obstacles, there's still been a steady rise in a new generation of Indigenous women entrepreneurs and influencers, hasn't there?
Yeah, definitely. And we've seen, also through our research that Indigenous women-owned businesses are growing. So in the last 10 years, the number of Indigenous women-owned business has nearly doubled. The number of Indigenous women who are looking to export and are export has also increased. The number that have revenue over $1 million has also increased. So there's this incredible growth. And the other really incredible thing that I found, both as a leader in this space, is just that support that other Indigenous women leaders provide to you. So when I took on this role, even when I came to CTAB, but also when I took on the role as CEO, I find so much strength in the Indigenous women who have been here before me, and they are so eager to support me. And within the entrepreneurship space, we see that as well. There's this incredible Lift Circle that started about a year ago, and it's now about 80 Indigenous women entrepreneurs, and they are supporting each other's business. They're collaborating by sharing each other's businesses, but also supporting from a business capacity perspective. And that, I think, is going to just propel the Indigenous women economy, but Indigenous economy forward, because we're not competing, we're holding each other up. And I think that is where we're seeing such significant success and optimism.
And beyond the COVID-19 crisis and its fallout, what would it take to ensure that every Indigenous woman in Canada has the opportunity to become an entrepreneur and the equity to succeed at it?
So I think definitely we need to look at ways that we can provide financing, and even debt-free, of course, would be incredible. And we have some really incredible partnerships. Just recently announced we have a partnership with LNG Canada, who's donated funds for us to provide grants to Indigenous women entrepreneurs. And prior to that, we had the same fund supported by CIBC. And those type of funds, even if it's the debt-free grant, it then helps them to have the collateral to be able to get a larger loan somewhere else, right? Just to remove their existing debt or be able to create a business plan, just that first step. I think we also need to look at the government programs that are supporting women entrepreneurs, which are fantastic. The Women Entrepreneurship Fund, the Government of Canada is fantastic, but we need to ensure that they are being accessed by Indigenous women, that there aren't unconscious barriers for them to be able to access that program. And that, potentially my preference would be that there was actually a carve out specifically for Indigenous women entrepreneurs within the Women Entrepreneurship Fund, because we still see that this access to networking and this access to those networks creates another barrier. And we need to make sure that the funding that's available is reaching the women that most need it.
And this kind of equitable access, it's not just beneficial for the Indigenous communities, but this is really important for the Canadian economy as well, right?
Definitely. There is a huge potential for, as we grow the Indigenous economy, for it to support the Canadian economy. Also, we know that Indigenous women-owned businesses, more than 80% of them, say their first priority is community and community support. So we know that these businesses are giving back to community either by supporting youth or supporting clean water programs, or have a sustainable part within their business plan. So if we look at where consumers are looking for ESG goals and looking for brands that are sustainably conscious, Indigenous businesses have that within their values from the beginning and have for some time. So I think we need to really be propping up that, and as consumers looking for brands that support the values that we believe in. But we also see that there's this ripple effect when you purchase, we know this for a small business. When you purchase from a small business, it supports your community. They're the ones who sponsor your hockey team and contribute to the school fundraiser. And we definitely know that in the Indigenous business world as well. They're giving back to Indigenous youth. They're more likely to employ Indigenous people. So this ripple effect on closing that socioeconomic gap goes even further. Your money goes further.
Tabatha, through the lens of your own experience, what advice would you give to Indigenous women, young women aspiring to become entrepreneurs or get into leadership roles?
I think definitely about taking the opportunities to build your network that are out there. And maybe that's about reaching out to individuals like me or other Indigenous women entrepreneurs, there really is this incredible network of support that wants to help and lift people up. And it's a big barrier for the network, for people who didn't grow up with parents that work on Bay Street or with parents that are lawyers and have access to these incredible networks. That's an additional barrier that we need to overcome. And that's really what CCAB was initially born out of about 40 years ago, was just creating that network opportunity. So I think for young people, if you have the opportunity to attend the event to grow your network, to take that opportunity. And actually, it's so much easier right now in this virtual world to be able to attend those events or to be able to reach out for a call. For some, it's much easier to do it over a video than in person, walking up to someone with a cold.
It's less awkward.
So I think also to be okay to change your goal. I never planned in my career to run a national nonprofit Indigenous organization. As I said, my plan was to work with communities on energy projects. But, when I reached that goal and I set a new goal, I had to be okay with changing where I was going. And if at some point the goal you've set isn't working or you don't feel that you have a passion for it, it's okay to change your track a little bit. And I think sometimes we have so much goal setting discussions and, pushed on us that we keep moving towards something that maybe when we were younger, we thought that's what we wanted to do. But as we change, our goals change too. And we need to allow ourselves to do that.
And it's okay to rearrange our signposts and adapt accordingly.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Tabatha. You've been so insightful. It's been great to have you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I was talking to Tabatha Bull. She is an Anishinaabe woman, a proud member of Nipissing First Nation, and she's the president and CEO of the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business. That's it for today. Thanks so much for listening. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Saba Eitizaz, Adrian Chung, and Raju Mutter. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattenden, and our director of programming is JP Fozo. Our show theme music is by So Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.